Good morning, everybody. I wanted to hop on here and do a review of chapters 6 through 10 for the wave. So at the beginning of this, I asked you to read some information about authoritarian movements, and two of the different things that they talked about were two different types of psychology. The first one was individual psychology, and individual psychology is basically what motivates us to behave like an individual. We are motivated to express ourselves in a lot of different ways to show who we are as people. That is part of individual psychology. We produce our own sense of who we are. Now, that is until the crowd comes into play. So, crowd psychology is basically where we feel we need to fit into a certain place. So, even though we want to be an individual, we also want to be a part of a crowd. And the authoritarian movements basically used that crowd mentality to push people to do what they wanted. So, the difference between individual and crowd psychology is the fact that as an individual, we are programmed to want to be different. But at the same time, as soon as we are put within a group of people, we are wanting to follow the crowd, whether we want to admit it or not. And that's how mobs and riots and things like that become started. The next thing that I asked you about was charisma. Charisma is that compelling attraction or charm that can inspire or devote others. You're going to hear my cat in the background, and I'm really sorry. Basically, other words for charisma are charm, drawing power, and magnetism. If someone has charisma, you want to be around them. You want to follow them. You want to be like them. And a lot of times, charisma can have some negative effects, as we've seen with Stalin and Mussolini and Hitler. Some of those negative effects include it dilutes your judgment. In other words, you're so attracted and drawn into this person's power and energy that you might blindly follow them to the ends of the earth. Another negative effect is that it's addictive. Sometimes when someone is overpoweringly attractive, and I don't mean looks necessarily, I mean just their persona, you can become addicted to being around them. It also disguises psychopaths. Clearly, with Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin, and I can think of several more examples throughout history, we are ignorant almost to the fact of these crazy psychopaths because of their charisma. And then the last one is charisma fosters collective narcissism. In other words, when someone makes you think that they are absolutely amazing, sometimes then that can spill over into your life because you follow that person. So obviously they're amazing. So now you are also amazing. And thus the two of you can do no wrong. All right. So in chapter 6 in our novel, there's a lot of new developments going on. There's, an addition to the motto, we had strength through discipline, and now we have strength through community. Strength through discipline basically means that, individuals aren't individuals anymore. We are acting together. We are now becoming a group, and that's kind of where the symbol and the salute comes into play. The symbol is a wave, and a wave is a pattern of change, and it has movement, direction, impact. And then you add in the salute, and now we have a lot of similarities to the authoritarian government. We have groupthink, where everyone needs to be on the same page, a physical salute, and there's that fear factor that's in there. The differences between what Ben Ross is doing and the authoritarian government, though, is it's supposed to be short term. He hadn't done it with the intention of getting rid of anyone or creating a huge issue or anything like that. Like, that wasn't his intentions. His intentions were to show the students that they shouldn't follow in the footsteps of what happened in Nazi Germany. Chapter 7, we are learning a lot about the opposition of this movement. And Lori's mom thinks it's very militaristic, sorry. And, people need to do things their own way. They need to be individuals. And she believes that, Mr. Ross is manipulating these kids. Now, Lori's dad, on the other hand, thinks that it's kind of a good idea because kids are paying attention. Our country was built on people acting together as groups. He thinks that it's teaching them cooperation instead of, nitpicking and talking about each other behind each other's backs. And he also thinks that it is fostering a sense of community spirit. Ben's wife, Christy, however, is struggling with this whole thing. She calls him Dr. Frankenstein, which, as you know, is the person who created a monster. She tells him that she doesn't think it's so much that his kids want to be prepared for class as much as it is they're afraid to not be prepared for class. She's afraid, and she asks him how far he thinks he's going to go with this. And, he seems to still think that he's in control. But as she points out, she says, I think you're becoming a guinea pig in your own experiment here, Dr. Frankenstein. So Christy's obviously hesitant. She is very nervous about the situation. In chapter 8, we now have the next step to our experiment, and David and Lori are talking about Lori's conversations with her parents, and Lori points out the fact that everyone is starting to kind of lose that individualism. They're not really thinking for themselves. As much as she hates to agree with her mother, she does. And David gets upset, and Lori kind of drops it. When they get to class, they now have a new addition to their motto, which is strength through action. And with these membership cards, I'm going to read from the text. It says, now we will all have membership cards, Mr. Ross announced. If you turn them over, you will find some of them have been marked with a red X. If you have a red X, you are a monitor, and you will report directly to me any members of the Wave who do not obey our words. Do not obey our rules. So this is like the ultimate step towards that authoritarian government. We now have monitors. We have people who are turning others in for not following the rules. And Lori's the only one who jumps in and starts to question it and says, what's the point of this? Don't you think that that's kind of not a great idea? And he says, it's just an example of how a group might monitor itself. And, he continues on and he talks about how community means equality within a group. And, as we all know, living in the world we live in, that's not necessarily true. What is equal is not fair, and what is fair is not equal. Students start taking matters into their own hands, and Mr. Ross makes the comment, he says, man, they were the Wave now. They are taking action on their own without him. At lunch, the students are kind of having a conversation about stuff, and Lori's questioning things, and, everyone's excited that there's no in crowd anymore. And Lori's very hesitant about all of this. She doesn't know if she agrees with it. She doesn't know if she likes it. But at the same point, Robert one of the characters brings up the fact that, she could be breaking the rules if she goes against what they're doing here. Chapters 9 through 10, there are some positives that we can see from this Wave situation. Students are completing work. They're including others. There's a sense of, superior support with everyone. Kids are prepared for class. But there are some negatives. People aren't thinking on their own. Kids are skipping class. Their answers are very short and blunt instead of thoughtful answers. Lori is also really kind of struggling because she's scared. She isn't alone in her feelings and fears. She has, they're blocking people from going into football games and everything else at this point. Lori's mom steps in again and says, this kind of seems like a cult. And, Lori still, for whatever reason, she can't explain it herself, tries to defend this whole Wave movement. And Lori's mom brings out a very important, point. She says, Robert's only safe as long as he keeps within the confines of the wave. In other words, he won't survive outside of school because nobody outside of school is a part of the wave. It's just in the school. And Lori's rebuttal is that she just doesn't understand why everyone's, being immature about this and following along with it. She just doesn't quite understand why people are able to blindly follow what's in front of them. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about in this is Mr. Ross gets called to the principal's office, and he is talking to the Principal Owens, and excuse me, the principal is actually kind of on board with it because he sees what it's doing for Robert Billings, but at the same point, he sees a lot of similarities between what happened in Nazi Germany and what's happening in his school. And Ben tells him, he says, I wanted them to see this opportunity to get a taste of Nazi Germany. And the principal is hesitant because he's afraid that it's going to go too far because there's no end in sight. Ross makes the comment, this experiment can't go any further than I let it go. But it's already gone past where he's let it go because they're already acting on their own. And then the principal warns him one final time before the end of chapter 10. And he says, I'm quoting from the book, to be perfectly frank about this, it's so different from anything we've ever had around here that I'm not sure what to think. I say, let's keep an eye on this thing, Ben, and keep your ears open too. Remember, Ben, this experiment, if that's what you want to call it, involves young, impressionable kids. Sometimes we forget that they are young and haven't developed the judgment we hope they'll someday have. Sometimes they can take something too far if they're not watched. Understand? Which is an excellent point because sometimes we forget that even though teenagers might look like adults, they don't always handle things the same way adults would. So that is your review for chapters. Good question. What chapters did we just read? Chapters, I think, 7 through 10, maybe 6 through 10. Stay tuned to the next video for the next set of chapters.